Today, on the Word Preacher Podcast, Esther is not a chick flick. The setup and the sting of Esther. I'm Brett Jensen, and this is the Word Preacher Podcast. Alright, our Come Follow Me curriculum for this coming week will bring us to the book of Esther. And let's dig right in by setting the stage and saying, previously we talked a little about the book of Ruth being the chick flick of the Bible. It really focuses on the relationship of Ruth and overcoming the social obstacles that are standing in the way of her establishing the family that she would like. Esther is one that a lot of women in the church, in many Christian faiths, really love and look up to. They enjoy this story very much. But it's not a chick flick. Now, that may seem a little off because we already talked about, focus on relationships, and this certainly has a big role to play. The relationship that Esther has with the king is a central role in this story, but the stakes of this story are not just people will think less of her. This is more than just simple cultural obstacles that are standing in her way. The stakes of this story are not just her own death, but the execution of family members and the extermination of her people. And what this means is that she has to use the things that she has available to her, her skills and assets, to overcome obstacles. And of course, even though the means that she has do not include sword and shield, a sling, a bow, or even the tent stake used by Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite in the book of Judges. She has feminine grace and influence, and she uses service and the need, emphasizes the need of us to magnify our natural abilities, using the talents that we have to bring to pass worthy outcomes. Okay, let's talk about the story. So it takes place in Persia. This is after the children of Israel have been carried away. It indicates that this was a group of individuals carried away during the reign of Jehoiakim, prior to Zedekiah, which makes sense, kind of the more noble people, including Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And apparently Mordecai's family were taken during this time. And the Persian king, whose name I don't know how to pronounce, Ahasuerus, he was king over Persia, and his queen Vashti was summoned at a time when the king and his men were drunk, and she refuses to come. Now, the scriptures, there are a lot of people that read into what it meant that they wanted her to come so that everybody could admire her beauty, that this might have been a lewd request. And it's possible the scriptures don't give a particular reason, only that the scriptures did feel a need to emphasize that the men who wanted her to come were drunk. They were in a state of poor judgment. But whatever the reason, the king became angry that she refused to come. His advisors fed that anger by telling him that, this example of the queen, this is going to spread to all the houses in all the kingdoms. In all the kingdom, women of the kingdom are going to follow Vashti's example and refuse to honor their husbands. So the king puts Vashti away and orders all in his kingdom that every man should bear rule in his house. is very important that he establish the men are in a situation where they need to be making the decisions. And it's in direct response to Vashti standing up to him. Now, of course, he was then without his queen, and so his advisors suggested that fair women be brought to him, that he select a new queen. Of course, naturally, this is a suggestion that pleased the king. And among those who are brought before the king is an orphan girl named Esther, who her parents had died, and she had been adopted by her uncle Mordecai. And she was very beautiful. She was brought before the king. Now, Esther had been given some instructions by Mordecai to kind of help her navigate the situation. Chief among those was a charge not to reveal her heritage. They were considered Jews, but you can see by the genealogy that's listed that Mordecai was of the line of Benjamin, through Kish, the father of Saul. Of course, that was no longer a royal line, but tribe of Benjamin nonetheless. So the women were very early on instructed. There's some verses that they talk about where they are not to come to the king except that the king calls them by name and delights in them. This is in direct response to the situation with Vashti. They did not want women standing up and thinking that they knew better than the king. Their role was to serve in other ways in the kingdom. So that doesn't necessarily put Esther in a position of power, but it's still a good position for her to be chosen as queen and take the place of Vashti. Now, he loves her, sets the royal crown upon her head. They have a big feast, and she's brought in to live with the king. In the process, shortly after this, Mordecai is standing in the king's gate and overhears a conspiracy among the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, who are wanting to kill the king. So he has one contact that's in the royal house, which is Esther. So he sends word to Esther about this. And Esther explains that Mordecai has discovered this plot against the king. They investigate the matter, and the chamberlains are executed. So already, Esther and Mordecai have proven that they are good and loyal citizens of Persia. They're not trying to stand up and cause problems. They're good citizens. Well, that was insufficient for the new chief of the princes of Persia, a man named Haman. He was full of pride, and he insisted that everyone bow before him as he passed. But Mordecai refused. Haman was incensed, felt disrespected, found out that Mordecai was a Jewish individual, and immediately sought to humiliate and punish not only him, but his people. He went to the king and encouraged him, persuaded him to send out a proclamation, a law, an irrevocable law, that on a certain day the people were authorized to slaughter all the Jews and take all of their belongings. It had been reported to him that they were outlaws. When Mordecai finds out about this, he rends his clothes and sits in sackcloth and ashes. Esther finds out that Mordecai is in mourning and sends some new clothes out to Mordecai, but he refuses these clothes, and then she learns about the situation. Now, Esther explains she can't just make this right with the king. This isn't like an assassination plot that she's bringing to the attention of the king. This is like a royal decree, and she can't just go and talk to the king because of the whole situation with Vashti. So Esther explains her predicament in Esther chapter 4, verse 11. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. So Mordecai explains she isn't shielded from this. He says, Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews, for if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? So that last sentence, that last question, who knoweth whether thou art come for such a time as this? That's really applicable to everyone. God frequently puts his people in circumstances in order for them to accomplish things, which makes it a good practice not only to be grateful for the blessings that you have received, but also to be seeking for what good that the Lord would have you do with these blessings. Esther displays her courage famously in verse 15. Then Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer. Go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me. Neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. So, in the context of everything that happened with Vashti, who thought that she could, tell the king, this is what I want, this is what's important to me, it was extremely perilous to go uninvited to the king and ask for something. Her heritage was a secret, and she might have been successful in hiding herself. She risked everything to save her family and her people. And then the sting. Let's read about how she approaches the king. Now it came to pass on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal apparel, and stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house, over against the gate of the house. And it was so, when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. Then said the king unto her, What wilt thou, Queen Esther, and what is thy request? It shall be given thee to half of the kingdom. That's in Esther chapter 5, first 3 verses. So the man obviously has a beautiful wife. He's naturally interested in whatever she's there for when she approaches him. But it still would have been perilous to immediately inject herself into the laws of the land. So what does she do? She plays to her strengths. Then said the king unto her, What wilt thou, Esther, and what is thy request? It shall be given thee to half of the kingdom. And Esther answered, If it seem good unto the king, let the king and Haman come this day unto the banquet that I have prepared for him. So this is a request to serve the king, the attention to take care of and serve others before asking for something of ourselves. This is a very good approach. It's an applicable lesson. And you see this in the Book of Mormon as well. Ammon's service with King Lamoni's flocks worked in the same way. Look for opportunities to help others, to love, to share, and to invite. building relationships with others helps to emphasize the principle that we are all children of God. This is why service is a manifestation of living a religion. We are to serve one another. So the king, of course, was absolutely thrilled with Esther. What a wonderful request. And they enjoyed themselves at the banquet. And he again, at the end, offered to grant her any petition that she might have, up to half the kingdom. But still, she served more. She requested a second banquet the next day with the king and Haman. Now, of course, the king was going to do that. He loved this. This was great. His beautiful wife wanted him to be happy and was serving him. This was ideal for the king. But also of note was the reaction of self-important Haman, who was thrilled that he seemed to be in the queen's favor. He even ignored Mordecai, who refused to reverence him as he passed at the king's gate, and instead prepared a gallows, anticipating that he would soon kill Mordecai as he reveled in what he believed was his good fortune. After all, he was going to a banquet with the king and queen, and soon his enemy would be dead. But then, to stir Haman's anger up further, the king had Haman pull Mordecai along on his horse and proclaim that Mordecai was the man that the king wished to honor, as a reward to Mordecai from him saving the king from those assassins earlier. This was humiliating. And he was in a little bit of a predicament. He recognized, would it be safe for him to kill this man that the king wished to honor? But before he could process the dilemma, he was summoned to Esther's banquet. And the sting. After another successful banquet, Esther is again offered to be granted any petition. The king absolutely loves her. She has honored and respected him. She's served him, and he was well pleased with his beautiful wife. Then Esther the queen answered and said, "If I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given to me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage." So the king, who has grown close, especially close to his wife, over the previous couple of days, is livid. And we see that in chapter 7, verse 5. Then King Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, "Who is he, and where is he, that durst presume in his heart to do so?" Now, the scriptures don't say this, but I sort of picture Haman sipping a cup of wine as Esther speaks, and then violently choking and coughing when it registers what she has said. It doesn't say that, but this is what she says. And Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." Then Haman was afraid before the king and queen. The king stands up. He leaves the room. It's not a good sign, but Haman desperately comes to plead before the queen. And when the king comes back from his garden, he sees Haman on the bed where Esther is, pleading his case, and it appears in the eyes of the king that Haman is trying to force the king's wife in his own house. A single word from the king is all it takes. Haman's face is covered and he is taken out of the king's presence. A servant of the king discovers the gallows that had been constructed for Mordecai, and at the king's orders, Mordecai is hanged thereon. Esther again approached the king and begged him in tears to stop the decree to kill the Jews. Again he extends to her the golden scepter. And though the king could not overturn the official law, he issued a new law that the Jews were authorized to organize themselves and fight against any who might kill and rob them. In the end, this story is phenomenal. It shows some very applicable principles. Pride goeth before destruction. Always be humble. Service for your neighbor will yield goodness. Building a gallows for your neighbor may yield your own demise. Also find your strengths. Feminine beauty and the service of Esther, these were good things that she cultivated and developed, and it was right that she did so, for by so doing she saved her people. Just as Ammon's competent defense for sheep converted a king, the talents that God has given you are worth multiplying. Indeed, we do live in perilous times, but who knoweth whether thou art come for such a time as this? We appreciate all the support for the Word Preacher podcast. Next week, we will be looking at the book of Job. Of course, there's a ton of stuff we did not cover in this week's reading. Please study that individually and with your family. And of course, as always, fight on.